Hello and welcome to Comedy in a Nutshell. I'm your host Mark Turner, and each episode funny people sit down and explain why comedy keeps pulling them back. The laughs, the disasters, the little victories, and the deeply unnecessary amount of thought that goes into one decent joke. Sometimes along the way we learn something, often by accident. I'm the comedy nerd who's seen more than 2,000 different comedians perform live comedy, and you can find out more about my journey in comedy fandom on my website, thecomedynerd.com. Please also take a moment to like, subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. Thank you. My guest this episode is a comedian, songwriter, and broadcaster whose musical wit has made him a distinctive voice in British comedy for decades and the UK's leading musical satirist. Best known as a long-time star of BBC Radio 4's The Now Show, he combines sharp satire, brilliant musicianship, and a gift for turning politics, culture, and everyday absurdity into songs that are as clever as they are funny. Alongside touring stand-up and festival shows, he's also written novels, performed stage work, and has one of comedy's most admirable catalogues of parody songs. It's comedian Mitch Benn. As I always say to people, I've got the things that I sent that I'm kind of personally quite interested in, but it's your episode, so I can't predict where you might take it, so please do take it to there.
By the same token, if I suddenly go off on one and you realise you haven't said anything for 20 minutes, do feel free to jump in. He's laughing. He thinks I'm joking.
Some of my favourite episodes are the ones where I say hello and my guest speaks for an hour and I say, I'm sorry, our time is up.
Yeah, we went to see a Q&A with Brian Blessed about 18 months ago at the Kingston Theatre. And I can't remember the name of the guy who introduced him, but he said a big long intro for Brian. And they sat in two chairs. And they said, ladies and gentlemen, Brian Blessed. Brian comes thundering on, walks right to the front of the stage and just starts going on about stuff and completely ignores the bloke and the chair, right? And he's just literally stopping up and down in front of the stage, we're just bloody anecdotes. And then at one point he turns around and notices, because you shut your face anyway. He's fucking magnificent, Brad. I've met him a couple of times. He's exactly how you think he's going to be. I interviewed him I interviewed him for a radio show once in this tiny little voice studio in Southwark, in like this booth, which is almost certainly the fullest that booth has ever been with two people in it. Because we are of comparable volumes. And yeah. No, he's bloody magnificent, Brian. He really is. Anyway, yes.
Amazing.
So
I absolutely love him. Love him, adore him.
Yeah, he's fantastic, yes. Right, okay.
So shall we dive in? Shall we go for it?
Probably better at, hadn't we? Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning. Was comedy a big influence on you when you were growing up?
Yeah, it was, although weirdly not as any kind of career aspiration. I didn't really intend doing comedy for a living until I realized I was doing it. And that actually seems to be not uncommon with the guys of my generation. You know, I remember when I was new in the 90s, you know, we would have the conversations among, you know, the various new and newish comedians of how did you get into this? And we all seem to have gotten sidetracked into it while we were trying to do other things. Like we were trying to be proper actors or proper musicians or a lot of ex-teachers.
Yeah.
Or indeed, because in actual fact, I've done a bit of teaching, you know, in various environments. And you do run into a lot of ex-teachers. And of all the other jobs, I'd say teaching is probably the closest to stand-up. Oddly, more so perhaps than any sort of other performing art I can think of, because you are essentially standing at the bunch of the room, the front of a room full of people who probably don't give a shit about anything you're about to say, and you have to sort of, you know, first of all, just get their bloody attention before you can even begin to sort of, you know, winning their confidence or anything. You just got to get them to shut up and turn around and face the right way. You know, that's actually half the battle in comedy clubs, is just getting them to face the stage. And so you do run into a lot of ex-teachers in comedy. But no, I suppose. I guess the people who were sort of in their teens when you had the alternative comedy schism at the end of the 70s probably regard themselves as having been ideally suited for it. But in actual fact, it hit me at more or less exactly the right time, because I'm thinking about comedy when I was a kid. I mean, probably the funniest thing was the Goodies. Let's face it. I mean, it's difficult to describe to people now just how ubiquitous the Goodies were in the 70s. You know, it's like they were not only on, as far as we could tell, about 6 months of the year, they turned up in everybody else's TV shows as well, and they had hit records. They actually they were on the Pops doing the Funky Gibbon, and it's difficult to describe just how massive the Goodies were, considering how they kind of completely fell off the cultural radar the minute they stopped making that show, which is which is kind of weird when you think about it. But also, I mean, not that I would have been aware of it at the time, but you have that schism in British comedy in '79 with the opening of the original store by Dawn and Pete Rosenberg, completely stealing the name from the one in Los Angeles and not licensing it. And then, they never got the license for the name. I don't know if they've ever had it. I don't know if they've got it yet. But then from that, and then that schism being off into the comic strip club, and then that then sort of moving over onto TV via the Young Ones and via Channel 4 and all that, and and then you have this kind of weird schism at the and so you've still got sort of what at the time was still called mainstream, although it increasingly got less and less mainstream exposure, as in the old school, mother-in-law jokes comedians, the comedians with the ITV show, they were still around and they were still getting on TV and everything, but somehow they become known as mainstream, although the alternative very quickly became the mainstream in terms of the amount of airtime it was getting. But it was, I remember, because weirdly enough, I mean, I'm very heavily involved in this year's Rick Mail Comedy Festival. Having essentially kind of muscled in on last year's, because it was announced in about February last year that there's going to be a Rick Mail Memorial Comedy Festival, and my first thought was, not without me, there fucking isn't. Literally, that was just the first thought. So we kind of pitched a whole bunch of ideas at the organisers, and they went with all of them. So I could only do the first weekend last year, but I ended up doing about 9 shows over the course of that weekend. And this year, it's a bit of a shame, actually, because this year, Kathy and I were going to be given our own venue to kind of curate, which is the venue that all my stuff was on in last year, which is the Working Men's Club, which is great because it's directly opposite, across the street from the Norbury Theatre, where they do all the sort of the high profile stuff. And it's gone under. The venue's gone under. It's had structural problems, money problems, and the place is shuttered up, which is going to be driving me nuts because I'm going to be looking at it all shuttered up, But we've managed to, everything that we'd already booked, we've managed to get into other places. So the actual shows are still going ahead, even if I won't have quite the little fiefdom that I thought I was getting, which is probably just, well, I don't really know if I'm a fiefdom kind of person, but the thing about the Rick Mail Festival, one of the reasons I was so desperate to get involved with it is it's only really when Rick died, which is 12 years ago coming up on now. It was only really when Rick died that I realized the extent to which he and Aid had been my rock and roll stars when I was a teenager. At that time when you're meant to be obsessed with a band, and you're meant to be obsessively waiting their new album and following them around on tour, I was absolutely obsessed with Rick, Aid, Nigel, and the whole crew, and just desperately awaiting their new TV show, whatever it might be. Those guys were my rock and roll stars when I was a teenager, and I've never met Rick, but I've met Nigel and Aid a few times, and I managed to tell Nigel and Aid this, so that's one of the reasons I was so determined to get involved in the Rick Festival, just because those guys. So, I mean, during the 80s, they were one of my obsessions, definitely. Comedy, I guess, in general, but specifically that wing, that axis, that sort of Young One / comic strip crew. Although I was talking about this with Kathy again the other day, because I finally got around to watching Mrs. Brown, the movie with Billy Connolly as John Brown, Queen Victoria's girl who snaps her out of it when she's been in mourning for too long. It's a great film, it really is. And you could only really make it in a world where there's Judi Dench and Billy Connolly. It's I can't, But I remember thinking there were 2 really pivotal stand-up performances that I saw when I was a teenager, which I was just enraptured just by the sheer energy and limitless potential of them. And it was The Audience with Billy Connolly from ITV, which I think was late 85. I remember seeing that. And Robin Williams at the Met from about the same time. And I remember I think I had both of them on VHS. I watched them both a lot just because, again, just the energy of both the performers and the fact that Billy in particular, I do think I owe a lot to, in as much as, it's funny, talking about, one day when I've got nothing much to do, which is probably never going to happen, it'd be quite fun to write a book about parallel movements in music and comedy, given that those are my two sort of, realms, as it were. And I often thought, to me, alternative comedy definitely feels, I don't think it was a direct consequence of punk, but it feels like it can only happen in that post-punk world. It's almost like comedy looking at what's just happened in rock and roll and thinking, could we do that? Could we do something that stripped down and confrontational and deliberately transgressive as what rock and roll just did? But weirdly, with both, in much the same way that, alternative comedy was regarded as sort of a direct, personal vendetta against Bernard Manning, which I don't think it was, much of the same way punk is sort of written up by, rock historians as like the whole thing was some personal vendetta against Rick Wakeman and Keith Emerson, And I really don't think it was, because when you look at what's actually in the charts in 1975, 76, which is when punk is about to burst, it's all so chicken in a basket and end of the pier. I don't think it had anything to do with Genesis. I think it was more about Brotherhood of Man. You know what I mean? I literally think it's like all these 17 and 18-year-old kids are switching on the top of the pops to say, for you, it's for me. And they're going, I am going to kill myself if something fun doesn't happen right now, So I think that's what creates it. But in the meantime, you've also got these two funny little, almost intermediate genres. In rock and roll, you had what was called pub rock, which was like this, they seemed to sort of come out of like sort of places like Southend, where you got these sort of tight little four-piece bands playing kind of snarly rhythm and blues. Most famous ones were Dr. Feelgood at that crowd. And while I think they would probably disavow ever having anything to do with punk, I think they kind of created the environment that punk could happen in. They got people back into the idea of four-piece bands playing, stripped-down rock and roll in small venues, which is what punk begins as, although everything begins as that. But similarly, in comedy, you've got, people always talk about there being this hard and fast schism in, saying, the end of the 70s between the frilly shirt brigade and the angry young men of alternative. But there's this intermediate generation of the folk club raconteurs who come out in the early 70s. They start off in folk clubs in the 60s, and their yarns and banter eventually start to sort of get equal billing with the songs. And they sort of evolve independently of each other and all cross over into something approaching stand-up comedy in the early 70s, which is interesting because first thing they do is they introduce an observational tradition to British comedy, which really isn't there at the time. The Americans have started to get the observational stuff in the early 60s with your Mozarts and your Lenny Bruces and that crowd. But it's above and beyond telling jokes in the first person, even if they're essentially third person gags. British stand-up had not really embraced that observational tradition, whereas these guys are very much about the observational tradition. And they've all got very, very strong regional identities, so they kind of align themselves to region. So obviously you've got Billy, who's like he's kind of the de facto leader of the whole movement, and obviously he's the Scottish one. And from probably next in importance after him, you got Carrot, who's the Brummie one. Then you got Mike Harding's the Northern one. Richard Digance is the Cockney one. Max Boyce is the Welsh one. You've all got these ex-folk singers with a really strong regional identity who sort of spin it off into this sort of observational storytelling. And the weird thing is, for all that I'm like, 25, 30 years younger than them, I actually feel like I've got more in common with them in terms of certainly my club stuff than movements that came along after. So I think we owe those guys a great debt generally, because also they, again, much as with, the feel goods of the world creating the space for punk to happen, I don't think the British comedy going public could have transitioned straight from Frank Carson to Alexei Sale if they hadn't had Billy Connolly and Jasper Carrott in the meantime.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
I don't think you can go straight from Bernard Manning to Keith Allen if you haven't had those guys in the meantime. Do you see what I mean? I think because again, there's the hint of transgression, even it's very good-natured transgression from those guys, and also just that sort of that very working class perspective, but not a kind of reductionist working. I mean, Connolly's a fascinating guy. I mean, I've read, his biography written by his wife, who is, of course, Pamela Stevenson, and is now, I think, a professor of psychology. I think she's very heavily qualified. Mm-hmm. Met Billy just once on the streets in Edinburgh in the Fringe. Met Pam once again. Very, very weird set of circumstances. But yeah, I do think he's definitely. Well, I mean, in north of the border, he achieved national treasure status in about 1974, and it's only increased in the meantime.
Yeah.
But I think he is, although I've got to work with Alexei a few times in the last few years, which again is just an extraordinary honor, really, to work with Alexei. It's like, it's like going to a songwriting collective and finding yourself on with Bob Dylan, and it's like, I realize that's a ridiculous comparison, but it's also quite accurate. I mean, this is the guy who's instrumental in the creation of what is now my art form, in a way, Yeah. And Alexei's an amazing guy as well. And I've read his autobiography, and he raised in Liverpool by staunch communists. Yeah. Like proper communists, like they used to go on holiday to Poland, I mean, literally, he's uproariously funny about that in his stand-up, but he's also very, very sort of frank and honest about it in his autobiography. So I mean, I had comedy heroes, but weirdly, I had no particular ambition towards stand-up comedy until essentially my mid-20s, when I realized that was what I was doing. I think it might be different for subsequent generations. The millennials and the Gen Zs they're growing up in a world post Rob Newman and David Baddiel at the Wembley Arena, whereby stand-up was maybe considered to be, something a bit sexy and glamorous, whereas it kind of wasn't when I were a lad. It wasn't.
Yeah, we know that's not true.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we do know it's not true. But I suppose you'd had this image of. I mean, because of course the old thing about Newman and Baddiel is, I mean, have I met Rob Newman? I think I've met him. I've met David quite a few times over the years. He wanted me to be in the stage version of is it The Infidel? The movie made with Omid about this staunch Muslim who finds out he's Jewish. It's a movie he wrote, and I think he may even have directed it with Omid Jalali, who I've known for years because weirdly, me and my first wife used to babysit his kids. It's all anyway. No, he used to live not far from us in Richmond, and Clara, my first wife, and I. Before our kids were born, we used to go and babysit his kids in Sheen. But Omid, I've known for decades. But he did this movie, at least because David Baddiel always goes on about it being the bane of his life that he thinks he looks cartoonishly Jewish. He thinks he looks sort of, he said he looks like something off one of Goebbels' posters, and he said particularly puts any hat he puts on instantly just makes him look more cartoony. But he says he do remember that every now and again when he was growing up, somebody would shout "Oi Paki" at him in the street, and he'd think, really? and then apparently when the White House first kicked off on TV, there was one review that said it's good to see an Indian comedian getting on TV at last. He's like, but and then he said I've just got those proper Middle Eastern Ashkenazi features, but above and beyond the fact that I'm Jewish and everybody knows I'm Jewish, I've just got a really sort of post-Middle Eastern face. And so the idea of The Infidel is Omid plays this British Muslim taxi driver who's quite a staunch Muslim, quite active. And then when his mum dies, he finds out that he was adopted and he's ethnically Jewish. And so that's it's just a fun story. But there's a character who's a Jewish cab driver who kind of shows him the ropes. Who in the movie is American. He's played by Richard Schiff at The West Wing, but they were going to make him British Jewish for the stage play. And David actually got me to audition for that, but at the end I couldn't do it because I couldn't get it around my own tour dates, which is weird because I'm not Jewish, but evidently I could pass for it if I had to. So there you go. But actually no, it's true. The two stage parts that I've been semi-officially offered and had to turn down, one because actually kind of embarrassingly the money wasn't good enough, was when they did a revival of Ghost Stories, and the narrator of that is Professor Goodman, who's played by Andy Nyman in the original. And again, it's a plot point that he's a Jewish university lecturer. And there's this other character that David wanted me to audition for, is the Jewish cab driver. So evidently casting people think I'm Jewish, which is weird because, I've always, grown up and sort of, when I started having this the long blonde hair and everybody going on about me looking like a Viking, which actually ethnically, if you go back about 1,200 years, I kind of am. But, evidently people casting for stage shows think I look Jewish. So fine. Everybody gets to be Fagin sooner or later, apparently. So,
With all these incredible influences, people you're watching on television, people you've since met and worked with, when you finally found yourself having begun doing comedy for yourself, what did you encounter that surprised you about what it meant to be a performer of live comedy? What was it you didn't expect?
I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I came to it from a more... I think I was more prepared for it than a lot of people because I've always been performing one way or another. Obviously I was in all the school plays. I was the dame in the school panto when I was 14. That's something I look back on these days with a degree of incredulity. That's something which is, playing. That's playing Russian roulette with your personality, isn't it? When you're doing the dame in panto when you're 14 and not everything's quite in place yet. But I did enjoy that. But then, when I was at university, I spent my whole time in the theatre. I did a lot of theatre, a lot of new writing reviews, a lot of improv. So by the time I finally did stand-up, I say finally, I was 21. But by the time I did stand-up for the first time, which was in Montreal, Canada, and that is a long story, which I guess we have time to go into, it was just kind of felt like an extension of everything else. I guess I was sort of more surprised by, not so much surprised as on a sort of a performance level, on a technical level, maybe surprised by on a structural level of sort of, how the business works. But again, it wasn't really a confounding of expectations because I didn't really have any expectations. I had nothing to base it on, So, I mean, it was a learning experience, obviously, discovering, what it takes to essentially get into the business, which, of course, has evolved completely. I mean, I will still sometimes get very young comedians saying, how do you get into the comedy circuit? And I say, well, I can tell you I get into the comedy circuit in 1995. It's not a lot of use, to be honest. I can tell you how we did it back in the day. Back in the day, you were in London, you got Time Out, you looked through all the comedy, Malcolm Hayes comedy listings, and you saw acts, interested act call, you called the number, and that was the beginning of the process. I did, because I started out, first time I did stand up, it was in the summer between my third and fourth years at university. I was at Edinburgh University, ostensibly doing the languages, because that's just what floated my boat academically. And also when I was about 13, 14, they had, I think, some of the kind of careers convention at my school. And they basically said, if you do languages at uni, you get to live abroad for a year. And I thought, sold. and that was it. And so basically, from about then onwards, it was obviously going to go to uni. As obviously as what I was going to do when I got there. From 17 onwards, I knew which uni. And then there I was until the age of 22, and you fall off the end of the rail, and you're like, shit, now what? I've pretty much known what I was going to be doing with my life for the whole of my existence. up until now, and there might be another 60 years of this shit, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of it.
Not the improverts, then.
No. Well, the improverts. Well, they weren't yet called the improverts when I first joined them. The improverts are the Edinburgh Uni improv troupe. They are still going. I was one of the first generation in 1989-90, and rather adorably at Edinburgh about 3 or 4 years ago, one of the current lot flyered me. and I'm standing looking at this flyer, and I actually said, I was in this before you were born. And these days, probably about 10 years before they were born, I was in this, because it's like over 30 years since I graduated now. The improverts were brought over to the Bedlam Theatre is this amazing thing at Edinburgh University. It's not like a dram sock, and it's not like a theatre club. It's a theatre. It's this old little black Gothic church at the end of George Fourth Bridge, and it's run by the students as a kind of autonomous collective. The student body are completely responsible for everything for the upkeep of the building, to balancing the books, to all the artistic stuff. It's a hell of a little sandbox. It's a great, because here's the thing, I've got quite a lot of old Bedlam pals who are now quite, great and good in the industry. Because I think that was probably a better training to actually doing this stuff for a living than any amount of breathing exercise and trustfuls, because it didn't just, you got the hang of all that shit as well. You learn how to project without, firing your larynx out of your face, and you learn how to, how to block, and you learn how to, get enough, psychodrama going that they can see it in your eyes rather than just hear it in your voice. That's a very important little corner you turn in the theatre, but it was this it also taught you how to hustle. It taught you how to pitch. It taught you how to stand your ground if people were trying to because you get little rivalries within the building. So it's an amazing little sandbox, the Bedlam, and I think because at any given time I've got quite a few famous ex-pals, and then so from that, when the improv was brought over by a guy called Toff Marshall, who was a Canadian classics grad student. He was doing postgrad in classics, and he was from Vancouver, but he went to McGill University in Montreal. And Montreal, obviously, massive comedy scene, probably not so much as once was, but there is still a big comedy scene in Montreal. And he had done what at university they call theatre sports, which is actually the official name for that kind of competitive team improv. And I think the Edinburgh one was called theatre sports for a little while before we actually realised that was a trademark belonging to Keith Johnson of the Loose Moose Theatre Company in Calgary, and we had to stop calling it that, and we probably owed him quite a lot of money. So that it started coming up with new names, and settled on the Improverts in about 94, 95. I think that's what they're still called. But to begin with, it was a regular Friday night show, like a late show at the Bedlam. Whatever big show would be on in the evening would be on like 7:30 till 9:30, and then they'd all clear off. And I think Theatre Sports was on like 11 till midnight. It became a regular year-round thing, and I think it still is. So when because I was doing languages. That was my second year at Edinburgh when Theatre Sports started, so I was already doing it. And then in my third year, I had to go. Well, I had to go. I went to live in Spain for a year. I went to live in a town in the southwest of Spain called Badajoz, which is spelled Badajoz, and is generally only known to, it's classic my dad, actually, because I got my orders through for whichever organization it is, because I did the English teaching thing.
Right.
Because I wanted to do that. I thought, I want to have something to do while I'm out there. And also, one of the reasons I applied to that is they send you wherever there's a gap. So I thought, I think I'll get a better bead on what it actually is to be living in Spain in, the arse end of the 20th century than if I do what everybody else does and go to Barcelona, Madrid, or Seville. You know what I mean? Because those are these massive metropolitan international, you don't. It'd be like living in, I don't know, Belgravia. You don't really get an image of what it is to be British if you live in something like that. Whereas this is more like being sent to Derby. You know what I mean? This is like except nobody had ever heard of it when I was going to. They said to me it's a Malakoff, and like none of my mates had ever heard of it. My mum had never heard of it, and they said to my dad, apparently got a Malakoff. He went, "Yes, Malakoff, 1811, longest battle of the Peninsular War." Because my dad, my late dad, had a brain the size of a planet, was a voracious reader, and an absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of history, particularly 19th century military history. And it's only later on I realized that he didn't get it from history books. He got it all from the better researched historical novels. He was getting it all from Patrick O'Brien and Bernard Cornwell and C.S. Forrester. That's where he was getting it from. You know, he was relying on these novelists to do all the research, and then he's just reading their rollicking yarns. But in so doing, he had this absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of military history. So, yeah, he's the only person I knew who'd ever heard of Malakoff. And there was indeed a very lengthy battle between the English and the French there in 1811. And most of the fortifications are still there. But in that year, in that summer between my summer in Spain and my final year at Edinburgh, I had to spend the 2 summers either side of that summer where I could practice my French. And I'd been in northern France for the previous summer, and because we had this connection going through Montreal, I thought maybe I could get to spend the next summer in Quebec. You know, maybe I could do that. So Toff, the guy who brought improv over, set me up with some of his old improv pals in Montreal. And I ended up basically spending the whole of the summer in 1991 hanging out in this comedy club in Montreal. And in fact, the first night I went, I ran into my mate Neil Smith, who was another Edinburgh Uni improv guy and one of my best pals. And I had no idea he'd been in Philadelphia all year on an exchange at Penn University. Now, I knew he'd been in Philadelphia, but I didn't know he was still in North America. And I had absolutely no idea he was in Canada. But I'm sitting in this comedy club and in walks Neil, and we're like, oh, what the fuck, you know? And we have a bit of a conversation. At the end of the night, this is the improv show. This comedy is called the Comedy Works. I think it's finally closed. Somebody told me it's finally closed. It's called Comedy Works, or occasionally Jimbo's, because the guy ran it was called Jimbo. And they would be on all night, on all week. I think they had Sundays off. Monday night was open mic night. And basically, if you got there in time to put your name down, you were on. Tuesday night was the improv night. Wednesday night was a sketch troupe called Radio Free Vestibule, who were a lot of the same guys as the improv. I've got some recordings of them. They were brilliant. And then Thursday, Friday, Saturday was club night. And what they would normally do is they get in a headliner, usually from out of town, often from the States. And they would do like 45 at the end. And then the undercard was like 2 or 3 guys just doing 10, 15 each. Yeah. So it's slightly different structure. British clubs, it tends to be 3 20s in a compare. That's generally rich. So the headliner doesn't actually do any longer, even if, you know, I mean, we'll get onto that later, but headliner is a word I'm often quite reluctant to use, except when it specifically applies. But in this club, it very much did apply, because it was kind of the local boys would be the undercard, if you will, and then they'd get some big deal in. So one weekend I was there, basically on the back of me bumping into Neil when the compere did the "so anybody here from out of town" question, I stuck my hand up and told him the whole story, and it got a round of applause. And at the end of the night, the compere came up to me and said, "You're a stand-up, aren't you?" And I said, "Not quite. I'm like everything else." But and he like, "Well, you should come back on Monday, put your name down." So I did. And then spent the whole of the summer in 91 essentially doing support slots in this comedy club in Montreal at the age of 21. Yeah. Partly because I was the only limey in town. Also because I incorporated the songs to begin with, which is kind of regarded as a bit of a no-no in North America, but nobody told me, so I went ahead and did it anyway. I'd written a couple of funny songs myself. I'd co-written some with a friend called Chris Hoban for various reviews we'd done in Edinburgh. So I just kind of pieced an act together out of this, and it went really good. So I was doing these. One weekend I was opening for Ray Romano, as in Everybody Loves Raymond, who'd only just done his first TV slot. He was talking about that. If I'd been there about a month later, I could have voted for Dennis Leary. You know, that was the kind of guy who was headlining this club in the early 90s. And then I went back to Edinburgh to finish my degree and kind of forgot all about comedy for about 3 years. A, just trying to finish my degree. B, because I had other things I wanted to do. I had, vague ambitions to be a proper rock musician or maybe proper actor or whatever. And my trouble was I was always quite good at quite a few things and probably not good enough at any one of them. And it's quite I often sort of envy those guys who've got that maniacal obsession with the one thing they've got to do. I was never one of those. But, because if nothing else, it would just clarify matters enormously. But everybody's just like, I'll just pick one. I'm like, which fucking one? How do I know that the week I decide I'm going to be a novelist was like the week before I got cast in, the next Indiana Jones movie? How do I know that the week I decide I'm going to throw it all in acting is the week before I was going to write the great British novel of the 1990s, you know what I mean? But my thought was, if I just keep as many irons in the fire as possible, eventually this decision is going to get made for me. And it ultimately was, because in 94, I was still living in Edinburgh. I'd just been dumped by my previous girlfriend. It was summertime in as much as it ever is in Edinburgh. And there's a whole chunk about this in the new show about Tom Lehrer. And I didn't have a show, so I thought, I'm going to go nuts. So I basically grabbed the guitar and spent the whole of that fringe wandering the streets, essentially looking for cabarets to blag onto, and as often as not finding one, because that was back in the early mid-90s. As the fringe, essentially, there is now, because of the rise of the free fringe, there is some of that ramshackle guerrilla element has been reintroduced to Edinburgh, but they kind of tried to stamp it out in the noughties. But in the 90s, it was still quite prevalent. And some of the sort of more, bohemian venues, idea of having a late night cabaret was essentially to switch the lights on and leave the door open at midnight and see who turned up. And sometimes it was me. And on one of these occasions, I was on with a gentleman whose acquaintance I've recently remade, and who had a great day together a couple of weeks ago. A guy by the name of Earl Oakin, who has been around for literally decades. He supported Paul McCartney on tour in the 70s because he was signed up. He was signed up to Apple as a young singer-songwriter at the end of the 60s. Earl is he's well into his 70s now. I mean, when I met him, I probably thought he was incalculably ancient because he was probably all of like 43, and I was 24. And at the end of one of my bits, I went, "Oh, that was rather good. Is this what you do?" And I went, "Well, not really." He said, "Well, you should. You're good at it." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So that was it. That was the moment at which I became a comedian.
Weirdly, I saw Loki at a corporate gig in Greece.
Wow, excellent.
He was the entertainment.
He does a lot of that. He's great. I mean, Earl's brilliant. I mean, he guy's just an absolute legend. He really is. I mean, he's dabbled in everything over the years, and he's got such bloody stories to tell. He must write his book. He really must. I know all kinds of people. I was like, write your fucking book. But anyway, so Earl it was who kind of persuaded me to devote my energies to this. And I kind of plugged away up in Scotland for a couple of years, ran my own club briefly in what is now the Liquid Rooms in Victoria Street. Myself and my mate Ian Kendall ran our own club in there for about a year, called the Rib Tickler. And then I started to trip down to London occasionally in sort of summer 95. And in particular, because I remember you sent me some of your potential questions. One was about competitions. And competitions is weird. I don't know to what extent they're still regarded as an important way into the industry. They became rather too highly regarded as a way into the industry in the sort of mid-late 90s. Right. Because suddenly there was a bunch of them. Because there was See You Think You're Funny, which is the really established one at Edinburgh. And then there was what started out as the BBC Avalon one, and then BBC and Avalon fell out, and it became the Avalon Daily Telegraph one, and still the BBC one. And a whole bunch of them sprang up. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure how great an idea this is if you're actually going to try and do this for a living in the clubs. If they're looking for the next TV guy, then fair enough. But if you're just going to, go and try doing this in the clubs, this is in no way giving you the skill set you need for the clubs, because in the clubs you need 20 minutes minimum if you're going to get paid. In the competitions, generally 5 minutes maximum. And of course, the environment is completely different because, as I said to earlier on, in clubs, particularly when you're new and they don't know who you are, the first point of order is to get them all to shut up and turn round. Literally, you've actually got to impose some kind of authority on the room because, they're not really that interested, a lot of them. And so I remember thinking, winning a competition in no way prepares you to actually do this for a living.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, one of the competitions I did do, one of my first trips down to London, is I did an open mic competition. Well, no, Mike, it was like a new act competition at a place which is no longer there, called the Cosmic Comedy Club on the Fulham Palace Road.
Yeah.
And it was 2 heats, and I won a heat and had to come back at the end of the month. And in the final, I won it, and Johnny Vegas came second. Now, here's the thing. This came back to bite me in the ass about a few years later, because I think it became apparent that Johnny Vegas was not happy with me about something, although we've never actually discussed this, because the one time I was in his company afterwards, he was too drunk to tell who I was, but that's a whole nother story. But apparently, and I think what it may mean, you see, I have occasionally recounted that by way of explaining, place not thy faith in competitions, because the one time I won one, the guy who came second to me then blew up like about 18 months later, became one of the biggest acts in the country. And I derived no particular benefit from winning this competition whatsoever. Actually, no, I tell a lie. I think he got me on Glastonbury. I think that was one of the things that got me on Glastonbury, because I then was invited to go and do a similar kind of new act thing at Glastonbury in '95, and yes. I won that, and I got a crack on the big stage. And then I played the big stage at Glastonbury every year for about 20 years. So tell a lie, I did get a benefit from it, because the big stage at Glastonbury was quite the experience, if you can pull it off. As you can imagine, there's about 1,500 people in there, I don't mean the pyramid stage, I mean the big comedy stage. There's like a big comedy they call it the cabaret stage, but it's like this massive circus tent, and you can literally get about 1,500 people in there, which you often would when I was there in the 90s, and the weather was terrible because it's one of the few places you could sit down. So yeah, I tell it. So I have occasionally told that story by way of illustrating, don't have too much faith in competitions. They don't really tell you anything. But of course, comedians, being the gossipy little bitches that they are, I think it probably got back to Vegas that I've been going around bragging about beating him in a competition, which is literally the reverse of the point I was trying to make. You know what I mean? But whatever, So that, I think, came back to bite me in the ass in due course. I don't know how big a deal competitions still are. I mean, as again, like I said earlier on, when people say, how do you get into the business? I tell you, get in the business 30 years ago. It's changed so much now. I mean, I've been going for 10 years before YouTube existed. And now there are people having entire careers on YouTube and TikTok. And if they ever get around to playing a gig, it's at the Shepherd's Bush Empire, and fair play to them, absolutely. But then again, you get other things, which is weird, like the TikTok thing in particular, and sort of Instagram Reels, which is kind of the TikTok that doesn't belong to the Chinese Secret Service, as far as we know.
Believes the CIA.
Exactly, yeah. It's picking. Sometimes it picks odd winners, because you were getting all these young, gorgeous comedians coming out the States with brilliant crowd work, and it's particularly. One of the reasons my stuff is not particularly well suited to that is my crowd work has never been great. It's actually kind of my weak suit, I think, because I'm coming at things from a kind of a theatrical end. Some people, I mean, obviously, the story of how John Bishop got into it was like the epitome of your non-performance comedian. Yeah. That is now the stuff of legend, because Bradley Cooper just made the movie about it, that he was, in the middle of a bad divorce and was pissed and miserable and wanted a pint, and they'd only let him in if he got up and did a bit. So he got up and did a bit and just bellyached about his divorce and brought the house down. And that's now, the plot of that Will Arnett movie. It's based on how Bishop got into the business. And I'm kind of in awe of, people like, John and people, those really conversational guys who just get up there and don't actually appear to be doing anything. Yeah. What do you do? He's not doing anything. He's just having a chat with the front row. You know what I mean? And yet he's bringing the house down because it's just so relaxed. And I'm always kind of in awe of people who can just be that easygoing. My stuff always, to me, feels quite contrived, because it is contrived, because I put a lot of contrivance into it. But by the same token, you were getting all these, walking sets of cheekbones with fantastic crowd work, who are all doing really well on that. And then all of a sudden, Jeff Innocent breaks massive on TikTok. And now Jeff is 10 years older than me, I think. Jeff's like well into his 60s. And he was certainly well established in London by the time I came down. But he just happens to have a couple of absolutely killer little 2-minute sections that he can put up there because, and you know, and again, he's so assured because, of course, Jeff's whole shtick is that he looks like the BNP made flesh. He's this big courtly geezer with a shaved head who talks like that, you know. But not only is he not racist, he's got a black wife and mixed race kids. Yeah. So he's got that fantastic line, you know. A bloke said to me, "Still in East End, are you, Jeff? Oh, yeah, never get me out of East End, mate." Said, "I'll bet you're the only wife on your street." I said, "I'm the only wife in my fucking house, mate." Which is just magnificent joke. I mean, it's, you know, it really is. It's like, yeah, I mean, he deserves to be able to retire on the back of that gag, you know. But Jeff has been touring, I think, for the first time, having been an absolute rock on the comedy circuit for 30 years. I think he's touring on the back of winning TikTok at the age of 60-something, you know. So it can pick odd winners like that.
You've mentioned so many great people that you've watched before. I mean, with all your experience in comedy, can you still sit down and watch comedy and just let it entertain you? Or are you like analytical? Or
you can't help but be a little bit analytical. But what I do like is when my analysis consists almost entirely of, oh, that's good. You know what I mean? I mean, I've been to see, and I won't name them, but I've been to see a couple of really big established guys. One of the things that Kathy's had a very beneficial effect on me since we got together about 3.5 years ago is that she's got me back into the audience. Because when you are a performer, you can get really out of the habit of being in the audience. Because on your nights off, you don't really want to be going to see somebody else do what you do for a living. But she's been getting me back in, and not just comedy, going to see, you know, been to see a bunch of shows. We see a lot of theatre. We went to see the new production of Cuckoo's Nest at the Old Vic last week. We went to see that. We've been to see all kinds of things. So probably the most fun thing we saw was Nicholas Eintner's revival of Guys and Dolls at the Bridge, the completely immersive promenade production of it, where you're kind of in it. You know, you're basically sort of you're the background players, you're the extras, you know, the audience. And it was magnificent. You know, my old theatre nerd head on my shoulders going, "Oh, this is perfect." You know. But she's got me, which is good because, you know, if you never see anybody else, then you kind of stew in a sort of puddle of your own, you know, you know, your own sort of mistakes and hang-ups if you're not careful, you know. But I did see a couple of really big established guys over the course of the last couple of years. And to me, it didn't really feel like they were phoning it in, but it felt like they'd really kind of blended it out now that they were as big as they were. Do you know what I mean? It's like, right, I've got, you know, the absolute mainstream audience in now, so we'd better water this down a bit for consumption. And it was all very entertaining, but none of it went anywhere. There was no through lines to any of it. There's no kind of, you know, for me, the hard part when I'm writing a fringe show is to come up with the narrative through line. You know, where do we begin? Where do we end? How do we get there? And what are the little turns in the road along the way? And that shows me basically where the songs need to go, for example, you know. And I remember thinking, well, that's great, but so what? You know, I came out of so what? But an old mate of mine is Milo McCabe, who is these days better known as Troy Hawk. I've known him for at least 25 years. He very briefly played drums in my band. He's the best-looking son of a bitch who ever drew breath and doesn't let it get to him on any level. Because I know a bunch of comedians who are nothing like as good-looking as Milo, who have really let it go to their heads a bit. And it's just like, look, if Milo can look like that and be a perfectly decent bloke, then none of the rest of you got any bleeding excuse. And then I've been watching over the years, you know, he started out doing various characters, came up with Troy about 12, 13 years ago. And even then, it took him a while to come up with an angle for Troy. But then he made him Troy Hawk of the Greeters Guild. Yes. And again, like TikTok and Reels and everything, of him just turning up because, you know, for the folks at home, if you don't know what Troy looks like, Milo is ridiculously handsome, okay? He's about 6'4", absolutely chiseled features, right? And he kind of dresses up as a sort of 1940s matinee idol, is the best way to describe it. He like combs his hair very carefully, puts on the little pencil tash, and then sachets around in a kind of silk smoking jacket and jazz baggies and spats, like he's relaxing between takes of an Errol Flynn movie in about 1942. And of course, in order to carry that off, you've actually got to have the raw material looks-wise, and he very much does. But then he became Troy Hawker of the Greeters Guild. He would turn up in all his bizarre finery in front of B&Q and say, "Good morning, sir. May I say I congratulate you on how well you've coordinated your tracksuit with your trainers," and compliment people on their attire coming in and out of gala bingo, And then this went absolutely nuts viral. But what is brilliant is the way he's used the material that the virality gave him, and now he spins these enormous shows out of it. Yeah. So I saw him at the London Palladium about 6 months ago, and I was absolutely made up to see somebody doing something on that scale, but still with the kind of attention to detail that you need to do when you're trying to sell a show at Edinburgh, for example. There was real thought gone into it. There was a real structure to it. It had a beginning. It almost bizarrely had a plot, which is about him trying to become best pals with Jan Molby, the Danish guy who used to play for Liverpool in the 80s. And also he's got this weird obsession with Scrabble numerology. That he's memorized what all the Scrabble tiles, the point scores of all the Scrabble tiles, and he keeps running into the same numbers when he adds people's names together. So he's developed this bizarre obsession with Scrabble numerology. And I saw his next show as a work in progress in Walthamstow about 6 weeks ago, and if anything, it was even better. And I'm like, that's what, that's so good to see somebody who is working at that level, but is still putting the kind of thought and effort into the structure and the shape of it that you had to when you were working at my level, because you can't not when you're at my level. There's got to be some shape to it, some form to it, some thought gone into it,
Yeah.
So that was great. So, I mean, in as much as, I'm developing any kind of critique, there seems to be a tendency for people when they get big enough that they are now mainstream to sort of, I don't know, just water it down a lot, and not even necessarily guys who were meant to be particularly edgy in the first place. I mean, there's nothing worse than self-conscious edginess. There's nothing worse than edge for the sake. Somebody talk about being the expression I heard of is pizza wheel comedy. All edge, no point. Which is nice. You see, self-conscious edginess for the sake of edginess can be utterly tiresome as well. But no, it's good. So I'm more used to being back in the audience now, which is good because I've also managed to rekindle some friendships on the comedy circuit that I wasn't sure were necessarily still there,
right?
Because people I hadn't seen for a long time, and so I'm feeling, And also, and I don't know, I seem to have turned a bit of a corner in the last couple of years with, I mean, maybe it's just when you've been around as long as I have, people eventually grudgingly sort of award you the sort of, the unofficial lifetime achievement award, the not dead yet award, because I do forget, because for me, it all seems to have gone in a bit of a hurry, but, I started when I was like, 24, and now I'm 56. And I have to remember that because I don't bloody feel 56. But, you have to remind. That was the thing I'd said to Robin Ince at the Fringe a couple of years ago, because he's a bit older than me, if anything, and he started about the same time as I did. And I said to him, you do now realize that we are now significantly older than the old farts were when we started. The guys we would look at and think, wow, he must be 40. You know what I mean? Because the thing about it, I mean, when I came down to London in 96, the circuit was 17 years old.
Yeah.
The circuit really began with 2 clubs in 1979. So the whole industry was only 17 years old. So even the lifers, even the ones who'd been in it from the beginning, might just have been in their 40s. They might have just made it into their 40s. The guys who've been in there at, the first weekend of the storm.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, now they're all in the 70s, you know, but there's a lot of them still around. But you know, but it is so weird. It's so weird. You know, so much time passes without you really noticing. I mean, one of the other weird things I've got, because I do Edinburgh, I've done Edinburgh every year. I've done it a bunch of times. I took a few years off in the noughties.
Yes.
So I had other stuff going on, like Parenthood and stuff like that. But I've done it every year now since 2011 that it's been on. I didn't obviously, it wasn't on at all in 2020, and then it was kind of on but not in 21.
Yeah.
But I went back in 22. But one of the things I've discovered is it has this horrible accelerating effect on time. Because the minute you get home from Edinburgh, right? You get home from Edinburgh, it's September, it goes dark, it starts raining, it's Halloween, it's Christmas. That lasts about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Right? That literally takes about 3 weeks. Edinburgh Christmas takes about 3 weeks. Okay. The minute Christmas is over, because of the way Edinburgh works, you have to decide whether you're doing it or not, basically in January.
Yeah.
And then the jockeying for the decent positions happens in February. And then you have to tell them what it's called, at least, and write a bit of blurb for it by the end of March.
Yeah.
So you're already thinking about Edinburgh. Then the Edinburgh Trail goes cold a bit through sort of April, maybe May. Then you've got to start writing it in June because you're previewing it all the way through July. End of July, you're up in Edinburgh. End of August, you come back from Edinburgh. It goes dark. It starts raining. It's Halloween. It's Christmas, right? So it's having this terrible slingshotting effect on time.
Yeah.
That my year consists of these two massive events and the build up to those events. So if you're not building up to one, you're building up to the other. I mean, I'm already looking at it. You know, I mean, it's the beginning of April. I'm more than 2/3 of the way back to Edinburgh again. and it feels like I finished the run of the Lehrer show literally about 6 weeks ago, but I'm 2/3 of the way back around again.
Well, how has your relationship with the festival changed? Because like you said about starting out in the 90s, but obviously in times gone by, you've done those Edinburgh shows year in, year out. How has your relationship with that festival changed from those first shows to the Lehrer effect of last year?
I mean, well, oddly enough, the Lehrer effect kind of was almost like a return to the early days because of the amount of attention I was getting. Because, as your listeners may or may not know, I mean, Tom Lehrer is one of those guys who either know who he is or you don't. He has been my hero as a comic songwriter since long before I decided to be a comic songwriter. I started doing this in the 90s, but I discovered him in my teens, and part of the show is about this. He was this maths lecturer that started at Harvard, accidentally became this kind of comedy songwriting star from the 50s to the mid-60s, and then just quit and went back to being a maths lecturer. And as such is kind of acquired legendary status almost immediately, and essentially was a maths lecturer until he retired in 2002, and then was just sort of living very quietly in California. And I was doing this show about him because, I discovered him quite by accident and people tend to discover him by accident. He's one of those, the epitome of one of those guys that, you find for yourself, and they're the ones you often stay really loyal to, the ones you feel like you find for yourself. And then I spent the whole of last year putting the show together about, because the other thing he did is the last thing he did of any great note was about 4 years ago, at the age of 94, he briefly resurfaced and said he had renounced all his copyrights and everything he ever did was public domain, which is the only way I could do this show. Because I could not only use as much of his material as I wanted, I could also cannibalize it. I could rewrite chunks of it, which is pretty audacious, but I think I got away with it. And then I spent the whole of the summer previewing it. And then the day after my final preview, 3 days before we opened in Edinburgh, he died. 3 days before I opened in Edinburgh. Now, as I say in the show, bit of a calculated risk spending all year working on a show about a guy who was 97 years old. But 3 days before you die feels kind of personal. But I've got to say, I must admit, it did us no harm whatsoever. Because it put him back in the news at the precise moment I needed him there. And some people literally said to me, and I'll put this in the show, have you got the same PR agency as the movie Conclave? That movie that came out like 18 months ago. Here's all the crazy shit that happens when the Pope has died. I mean, it's literally, Oh, maybe I'll watch that movie. And so yeah, and so I got written up in the Telegraph last year. Now, not only is it, I think, the last time I got a write up in the broadsheets for anything was from my tour in like 2011. Got written up in the Guardian when I was out with the band. I think it was the last tour I did with the band. But I haven't had the broadsheets review in Edinburgh since 1999. And I get it, because the thing is, when you go there, and I actually heard a line about this in a show they called The Point a couple of years ago about, the reasons to go to Edinburgh and how none of them apply to me anymore. First of all, you go is when you are kind of new and you want to kind of announce your presence to the industry and show that, you've got a bit more going on than 10 minutes of dick jokes in the clubs, that you can put an hour together and there's maybe something to you. That was me in 1995, right? Okay. And then the next time to go is when there's a bit of a buzz about you and it looks like you might be this year's boy and there's awards buzz, but, closest I got to that was 98. Didn't happen then, not happening now, And then the next reason to go is when you're already a big TV star and you can rock up for one weekend, do 3 sellout shows at the exhibition centre in Fountain Bridge and piss off with £500,000. Not me then or now. It is never going to be me, So the reason I keep going to Edinburgh is a couple of reasons. One, this is kind of ironic. I usually make a fair bit of money at Edinburgh, and I realise that is almost heretical, but I don't spend money on shit I don't need. It's as simple as that, really. I can usually, for a couple of years there, I was paying for my own accommodation. That is going to be the main obstacle to do for most people doing Edinburgh now, is the accommodation is just nuts. Yeah. I mean, it was always overpriced, but now it's nuts. And there's been a couple of reasons. One, they actually changed the law in Edinburgh to make it easier if you were living in rental accommodation the year round in Edinburgh, that your landlord couldn't just say, by the way, use lot are out in your arse in July because I'm going to coin it in at the Fringe, and so you can't really complain about that, but by the same token, also, above and beyond the sort of cottage industry of short-term letting agents that's grown up in Edinburgh for the express purpose of finding people somewhere to live for the Fringe. Yeah. A lot of people just can't be asked for that now. They just stick the whole thing up on Airbnb at £200 a night. So if you've got to be up there all month, you're £6,000 out before you've even arrived. Yeah. But the other effect it's having is that people can't afford to come and see the shows, because the shows are not cheap. But if it's going to cost them £300 a day just to geographically be in the city, they're going to look at that and they're going to price it against, a fortnight in the Algarve, and they're going to think I'm out my bloody mind, Yeah. And one of the other reasons I've been doing afternoon shows for the past 15 years is actually paying off, is that a lot of people are now day tripping it. They're staying in, Newcastle or Glasgow, and they are day tripping it because it's cheaper to commute in from Newcastle or Glasgow than it is to actually stay in Edinburgh. So the point is, if you're doing a show that is on too late for them to get the last bus home, they're not going to come and see you. So I've been doing afternoon shows for that. That's one of the reasons I've kept up with the afternoon shows. But yeah, when you start out, I mean, I guess there was, like I say, the Fringe has changed, because when I started out doing it, I was doing it very guerrilla. For the first couple of years, I was doing a two-hander, kind of a double act thing with my pal Ian Kendall. We were on a venue called the South Side in Nicholson Street, and we were literally doing all our own flyering because we had nobody else. And we were Xeroxing flyers as we went. You know what I mean? Yeah. They were black and white flyers that we were literally Xeroxing handfuls of the morning, abusing the photocopier privileges in a shop that he used to work in part-time. we get in there and abuse their photocopier privileges and just literally Xerox off a stack of flyers and walk up and down the Royal Mile handing them out all day. So, but it was quite guerrilla, and so were we. And then everything got a bit tightened up over the course of the noughties, to the point where, see, here's the thing about the Fringe. The great thing about the Fringe is also one of its pitfalls, which is that you cannot be not big enough to do the Fringe. Most comedy festivals, particularly the international ones, there is a degree of selection involved. You have to be selected or invited to perform by some committee or another. Yeah. The whole point of the Fringe is that does not happen. If you can get your shit together, you're on. Yeah. It's as simple as that. If you can sort out a venue, sort out your listing in the program, whatever, you're on, okay? You cannot be not big enough to do the Fringe. The flip side of that is you cannot be too big to do the Fringe. So then you end up with situations where, Ricky Gervais is selling out 5 nights at the Castle Esplanade to 10,000 people a night. and that's in the Fringe program. And you're like, a movie star doing an arena show is in the Fringe program. And you're thinking, and I remember thinking, what this Fringe needs is a bloody Fringe. And it has now acquired one through PBH and the other rival outfits with the Free Fringe.
Yes.
That has got some of that, some of that outlaw spirit from, my early days. And I imagine the days before that. Peter has written his memoir, Freeing the Fringe. I'm sure you know Peter. He's an extraordinary, I've known him since the 90s, extraordinary guy. But yeah, and that has, and also what it did do is it really challenged the prevailing economic model, which is good because the prevailing economic model had gotten pretty toxic because by the sort of 90s, noughties, the prevailing wisdom was that even in a great year, you will lose $8,000. Minimum. You can sell out the Pleasance for 3 street weeks and you'll still be $8,000 in the hole at the end of it. So what happens was you had like a whole couple of old generations of comedians came down the pike who never questioned that, never even examined the possibility of not losing $8,000. So then what you have is you have rather sharky promoters will come in and say, well, since you're going to lose $8,000, just let me take care of everything. And you don't even know where your money's going. You know what I mean? You just assume that it's all being spent on worthwhile things and not on somebody's cocaine budget, And so one of the good things is, because I've never lost money through this because I never spend money on stuff I don't need. I don't need my face on the side of buses. You know what I mean? I don't need that. Well, I don't. Yes, exactly. Kathy is uproarious with laughter at the idea of my face on a bus. But you all know what we're talking about. Now, the thing is, maybe if you're coming up there in order to be, this year's boy and you want to get it, maybe then that's worthwhile. Never struck me as particularly worthwhile. I guess also I've been going for so damn long, and in particular, I have a bit of a following at the Fringe that I don't need to do as much of that, so I've got that advantage now, I guess. But one of the things which the Free Fringe has definitely done, in fact, even on the money fringe, if you will, is that it's sufficiently challenged the economic model that even those of us on the money fringe are going, I see no reason to just accept that I'm going to be $8,000 in the hole by the end of this. In fact, you know what? I am not going to be, because I remember, funnily enough, we just mentioned it, the Liquid Rooms, where I used to run my comedy club in the 90s. Last time I was in there was about 2018, 2019. I went to see Sophie Hagen doing her show in there. And she must have had 300 people in there. And it was a free fringe show. And that must have been about $2,000 in that bucket by the end of that show. And I'm thinking, even the guys on Channel 4 are looking at that and going, wait a minute. You know what I mean? Wait a goddamn second. So, it challenged that, which is good because it was bullshit. But the other reason I do the Fringe these days is because it makes me hammer a show together, which I can then take on the road. And so that's what I'm up to at the moment. I'm touring the Lara show right now, which we did at the Fringe last year. I've only done 2 dates so far at time of recording. They've both been pretty good and pretty full, which is nice. Whether that sustains, I don't know, because it can be difficult. Obviously, I'm not sure if that momentum of Tom dying just before we opened, which I'm fairly sure put at least 10-20% on our numbers in Edinburgh. I don't think that's still, I don't think that's still happening. I think that is abated by now. But the other thing is, it is difficult even touring, even with the kind of profile, I've got a pretty good profile for somebody who's never done regular TV. I built up the profile all the years on the radio. To the point where people assume I'm still on the radio. It's 10 years. It's 10 years now. I've not, since, the Now Show ended 2 years ago, but 8 years previous to that, they got rid of me. So, it's like, it's now 10 years since I've been on the radio in any kind of capacity. I've never been on TV in any kind of regular way. I did present a show in the very, very early days of ITV Digital, when basically they were still in like 1998. When they were still trying to sell the decoder boxes. So they had to put something on. You can't flog the hardware on the understanding that there will be a channel eventually. So this was stuff we were putting out pretty much in the knowledge that almost nobody was watching it. You know what I mean? But it was quite fun. But it's interesting because another person who I've reacquainted myself recently is Ian Lee. because we had the same management in 98. And in fact, myself, Ian Lee, Mackenzie Crook, and a guy called Zarin Gibson, who I've completely lost touch with, we had a sketch strip that year called the Bootleg Beatles,
Yes.
which went really well. But the thing is, Ian, we'd all been up for the 11 o'clock show earlier on that year. I did a non-broadcast pilot for it with Dom Jolly, which Kathy recently found the VHS of, and I haven't had the balls to watch it. And Ian, they did a pilot run. I didn't get it because they told me my image wasn't youthful enough at the age of 28. And then in the pilot run, they got Fred Macaulay in, who Fred, absolute prince among men, but was already 42 and bald as a coot. And I'm like, oh, so that's how youthful I'm not at the age of 28. But Ian was out doing the VTs for that little pilot run in the early summer of 98. And then they promoted him to be the anchorman of it when they came back to do a proper run in the autumn. And I'd already been signed up to do this show on ITV Digital. And when I met Ian a couple of months ago, I reminded him of a conversation we had right at the end of that fridge. It's just bloody funny. We're sitting around, we were living in the same flat. We're sitting around in the kitchen of this flat. And I just put my first CD out. So I was flogging the CD at the end of the shows and actually doing all right off of it, And I'd already been signed up to this thing in ITV Digital. He was going to be, going back to the 11 o'clock show as the proper presenter soon after the festival ended. And we're sitting in the kitchen. He goes, I couldn't hit you up for a tenner, could I? And I went, yeah, I'm all right. And he went, yeah, cheers, and just completely broke. And then on his way, he said, you sure you're all right for this? And I went, oh yeah, my TV show starts as soon as I get home. And he went, yeah, mine doesn't start until October. And then there's this pause, and we just looked at each other. Oh, what a pair of cunts. Like anybody overheard that? It's like, what a pair of wankers! Yeah, my TV show. Oh, cool. My TV show doesn't start. Yeah, but yeah. So that's why I keep doing the fringe. Basically, it's because I like to keep talking. But again, case in point, right? Case in point of how hard it can be just to get them in, right? Yeah. Last tour, one of my worst selling shows was in Esher. Right now, I live in Richmond, which is not far from Esher. Esher's just kind of the other side of Kingston and Surbiton. Yeah, and it's a chocolate boxy little commuter town. It's perfect Radio 4 country. It should be right up my street. You know what I mean? Yeah. But we couldn't sell anything. We just whatever we did. I was making videos. I was doing trying to get radio slots. Couldn't, and you end up going to this lovely little theatre. It seats about 300, and I'm playing about 40 people, and it's all a bit bloody awkward. But I get to the end of the show. Show's fine, and on the way out, I look at the poster and I see Greg Davis is on there the previous day. Now they go, well, I never stood a bloody chance, did I? You know what I mean? Now, again, Greg, won't have a word said against him. Very nice man, and cured my nighttime incontinence. Long story. But, well, no, I went to see Greg doing a WLP in Walthamstow, and he's a couple of years older than me, and he was saying about saying, being in your 50s having to get up for a piss. I was up to like five times a night being for a piss. That's not a night's sleep, is it? That's 7 hours of piss with naps. And in the end I said, yeah, I feel your pain. And he said, saw palmetto, get to Holland and Barrett, get a big jar of tablets called saw palmetto. I would take 2 every morning and sort you out. And they did. So, yeah, I won't have a word said against Greg. He cured my nighttime incontinence. But I haven't got a bloody prayer if I'm on the same venue as him the next day, have I? Let's face it, everybody who was going to see comedy in Esher that week had been there the previous day. You know what I mean? Yeah. And that's the kind of thing you're up against, So it's difficult, it's difficult. Yeah. But, it remains to be seen how this one's going to go. But it's off to a good start already. And then the other thing is Kathy and I are being quite proud. There's a couple of things that we've kind of made happen, which feels good. I mean, obviously, I didn't make the Rick Mail Festival happen, but, I sort of, we muscled in on it very much on our own initiative. The other thing, which has now become a regular thing, is I now spend my Decembers doing my one-man version of A Christmas Carol.
Yes.
Which I'm already hunting for venues for this year. Because I left it a bit late last year. Again, because Edinburgh's like this sort of monolith on the horizon. You can't really see past it until you're the other side of it. And by then it was a bit late, but I still managed to rack up about 16, 17 dates last year for it. It's a book I'm ever so slightly obsessed with. I did the whole thing as an audio book many years ago, just off my own bat. And that's up on my Bandcamp site. We're talking about my Bandcamp site in a minute, because that's a whole nother story. And then I'd often thought it would be fun to do it live. And then I became aware of the fact that while the book itself, because I know this from doing the audio book, it's not a big book. It's only a novella, really. But it's still 3.5 hours long if you read it out top to bottom. And I discovered that Dickens had cut it down to like an hour and a bit for live performances purposes. And so I thought, oh, Doctor Who fans might remember that's what Simon Callow as Dickens is doing when they find him in Cardiff all the way back in series 1. And a lot of people at the time were like, really? No, really. He used to do it live, And so I managed to find a copy of something which purports to be that, although I managed to find 3 or 4 slightly. Apparently, he kept changing his mind about which bits to leave in and which bits to cut out. But that then brings the whole thing down to about an hour and 15. And I thought, rather than read it, which would involve, standing at a lectern with my specs on. I hate performing with my specs on. It's weird. I find it creates a weird barrier between me and the audience, which does mean that my show notes in Edinburgh have been getting further and further away. When I first started to need cheat notes for Edinburgh, I used to tape them to the side of my guitar, right? I can't read anything that close now. So now they're written in large print on A4 bits of paper on the floor. And there's going to come a point where even that doesn't work. But I thought, no, I'm going to have to memorize it and do it as like a dramatic monologue. And I did it as a one-off in 2019 in this lovely little venue called The Space in the Isle of Dogs. But I live in Richmond upon Thames, and it's easier to get to Cardiff than it is to get to the Isle of Dogs. It really is. It's a lovely. Apparently, it's Ian McKellen's local. When he did his spoken word tour, he previewed it there. But it's a lovely venue, just an unbelievable pain in the ass to get to. And then, of course, 2020, nothing was happening. 2021, there's Christmas 21. I had all kinds of personal crap to deal with. 22, I had a bum knee and couldn't do the running around. So 23, I thought I'm going to resurrect this, and I managed to do it at a tiny little theatre called the Barons Court Theatre, which is just basically a pub.
Yep, I was there.
Yeah, you came to see one?
I was at that show, yeah, the first one at the Barons Court.
Oh, man, excellent. Well, you know exactly what I'm talking about then. Okay, great. Okay, we should probably still talk about it for the sake of the punters.
Yeah.
And then I did a run of it in Barons Court in 23. Basically, I phoned around a bunch of venues. I think it was already about sort of October. I went, has anybody got any gaps? Because the thing about this show, because it's technically so simple, as you know, the staging consists of a wooden block and a hat stand.
Yes.
And that is because when I went to check out the space in the Isle of Dogs in 2019, on the stage, I have no idea why, were a wooden block and a hat stand. And I looked at it and thought, all right, I see what I'm going to do with those.
Yeah.
And I instantly saw the whole staging in my head. So that's why it's now a wooden block and a hat stand. Are the two things that I use. They're the only props of the whole thing. And Leo, the guy who runs the Barons Court, when I emailed him, he's like, oh, thank God, my Christmas show just dropped out of me. Can you do 2 weeks? And I'm like, no, but I'll do you 5 days. So I did 5 days. And then the next year I did a run at Barons Court and a one-off in Belfast for an old university buddy of mine, Davy Campton. And then last year I did Barons Court, but I also did one up in Scotland, Galashiels. I did the Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, which is very weird, but we got it to work. Did Droitwich, where the Rick Mail Festival is, because, get on with those guys really well now. Did Mac Arts in a little town in Scotland called Galashiels, which is where my kids now live with their mum. So that's become sort of my Decembers now, because apart from anything else, club comedy in December is horrendous. It's an office piss-up hellscape. That's when you get, and again, I can understand why, if you've got a venue that sees 200 people, if you can sell it with 5 phone calls, of course you're going to. But those comedy clubs become almost unplayable at Christmas, because you got these people who've been mutinously dragged out to a comedy club for their office piss up, and all they wanted to do was get drunk and get off with each other. But now they've got to sit through 2 hours of this bullshit first, Because, in every party of about 35 people, one of them had the idea to go to the comedy club rather than just the pub like they always used to. Probably explained it to another two, and the other 32 have no idea what's happening until they get there, and they rather resent your presence, as you can understand. Comedy clubs, it's the only thing. I'm a big softy about Christmas, as I always have been. The only thing I didn't like about Christmas is trying to do stand-up. So the Dickens, if nothing else, it gets me out of that. It gets me out of that loop. But what can I say? Yeah, Bandcamp. That's been my other big project the last couple of years. Is that it's about 2 years ago now. Kathy said to me, because my Bandcamp site, the only thing you would ever really see any action was at Christmas, because I've got this ever-expanding Christmas album, which has now got about 35 tracks on it. All originals. As far as I know, I don't think anybody else has ever done a Christmas album with no covers on it. People put Christmas albums on, but it's always the same 12 bloody songs.
Yeah.
I really don't know how many more interpretations of Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire the world really needs. But mine are all, because, obviously I was writing for the radio for a lot of Christmases, and then I still write one at that time of year, most years.
Yeah.
And so I've had this, and they have the audiobook of Christmas Carol, and they do really, really, particularly I put them both up as for free during lockdown, have them, in actual fact, it's not even free. Bandcamp, the way it works, is he puts it up for free. You're putting it up for minimum price nil, so people can still pay for it if they want. And oftentimes you find you make more money on the stuff that's free. It's weird. The psychology of that is endlessly fascinating, but people will more happily pay for something when it's their choice. It's weird. Yeah. But in any event, she was like, right, how many songs have you actually written? And I went, I do not know. Because there was a time, again, I mentioned it in the show, that it went absolutely nuts, because I started doing the Now Show in 99. Then we were doing 3 runs a year of the Now Show, usually 2 6s and 8s. That's 20 shows a year. Yep. So writing 3 songs a show for that. Then very soon I got signed up to It's Been a Bad Week, which is kind of the Radio 2 version of the Now Show. Me and Punt and Dennis again, still news-based, but kind of wacky little and finally kind of news items rather than the big satirical stuff. Usually doing either 12 or 18 of those a year, writing 2 songs a year for that. I eventually get, my own show on Radio 4, get Mitch Benn's Crimes Against Music. We only ever do like 3 seasons. Don't do very many of them, but I'm writing 5 songs a show for that. I start getting weird little commissions, like writing the songs over the end titles of Bremner Bird and Fortune. In 2008, Watchdog wrote me in to do a bunch of consumer complaint rock videos. Basically, by the mid-late noughties, I'm writing about upwards of 100 songs a year.
Yes.
And, because you imagine trying to maintain any semblance of quality control is not easy. But in the meantime, I've just racked up this ridiculous catalog. And so Kathy said, how many? And said, right, well, what do you, apart from the 60 or 70 that are on your actual records, what are you doing with them? I don't know. They're kind of sit on hard drives. So he said, right, screw that. We're going to put them all up on your Bandcamp. And I'm like, all of them? And she's like, yes, all of them. I'm like, well, some of them are specifically about a news story that nobody's remembered since 2002. And she's like, well, that's what the sleeve notes are for, you idle bastard. I kept typing. So what we've been doing for the past 2 years is putting everything up on Bandcamp, which has also involved re-recording a lot of it, because some of it actually predates the time when I actually had any decent home recording equipment. So I don't actually have a decent recording of some of these songs. So, I've spent most of last year re-recording all my early stuff, much like Taylor Swift, which is the only time my career is ever going to overlap with hers. And at the last count, 135 albums.
Yes.
On my Bandcamp page, there's a bit of overlap. Some tracks turn up on more than one, and some of them are only EPs, some of them are like 5 or 6 songs. But there's 135 of them. So if people want to go to mitchbenn.bandcamp.com, because the other thing this has spun off is the podcast I'm now doing, which is a thing called We Know a Song About That, Don't We?
Yes.
Where essentially, because I've been writing topical songs for 30 years, pretty much anything happens in the news, I've already written a song about it. So what we do in the podcast is talk about what's happening in the news this week, and then I play you the song I wrote the last time it happened. So that's just getting some use out of the back catalogue, and also most people will not have, some of these songs were literally broadcast twice in 2004 and then never touched again, although sometimes it's weird, because sometimes you can get one. I can get people requesting songs at a gig that I have no memory of having written. And people say, Yeah, do the one about the badgers. What? Do the one about the badgers. I wrote a song about, yeah, the one about the, and maybe there was like one now shows, the one that they happened to have on cassette from back then. And they've been listening to it ever since. And of course, to me, it's all gone. Come on, you miserable bastard. Do the one about the badgers. I don't know what I'm talking about. I have done one about badgers. I've just remembered it's 4,000 quid for a badger. It was the piss take of the man with the golden gun. It was when do you remember when they tried to do a badger collar for a minute there? They were going to send out literally sort of, armed assassins to go individually shoot badgers. And they calculated it was going to cost 4,000 quid per dead badger. So they decided sending Scaramanga out to do the badgers,
So look,
Yeah.
the thing is, you've got this prolific output, not only in music, but obviously all your contributions to broadcasting. You're an author, a columnist, all these things you've got under your belt. Edinburgh shows, I mean, I can name just a few that I've seen. Don't Believe a Word, 37 Beatle, I'm Still Here, 10 Songs to Save the World, It's About Time, The Point. On and on they go.
Yeah, they do.
Where are you at your happiest? You do all this entertainment. Where are you happy? Is it in the writing? Is it in the songs? Is it live performance? Where do you find your comfort zone?
Still, nothing can beat live performance when you've got the numbers in and they're loving it. Very little can really beat that. Whether it was, when I used to go out with the band and we used to put on this full-size rock show and, we filled the Bloomsbury Theatre and I played an absolute blinder and that was wonderful. Yeah. Or in the early days when I used to, do the comedy stage in Glastonbury, you got 1,500 people. I used to end with my BBC Perfect Day. You remember in 97 when the BBC did that all-star version of Perfect Day? Yeah. I used to end with that, but trying to do all the voices, including Heather Small and Tom Jones back to back, and that was, because, I've got video of that somewhere, yeah.
That always make me laugh, because they're singing a song about heroin. I'm like, why?
Yeah, I know, yeah. Oh, that's one of those great misunderstood songs. Well, I've got, a Lou Reed spoof in my Tom Lehrer show. You'll have to come and see how that works. But I guess nothing can really beat that when you've got the numbers in and they're absolutely loving it. Nothing can really top that. And I think that goes for performers of all stamps. I think that's how everybody ended up on heroin in the 70s because, it's a very, very difficult thing to come down off. It's not an easy thing to come down off. That kind of rush, to then go back to your hotel room with, however many underage chicks you drag back with you. It's all gonna feel a bit hollow, And I think that's probably how all the rock stars ended up on heroin in the 70s. It's a difficult high to come down. So God knows what it's like when you're rocking Wembley Arena every night, and that's it's got to be a very, very difficult thing to in any way incorporate into some kind of sane lifestyle, But other than that, I don't know. If there's one thing I wish had gone better than it did, it was the books, because that was quite a sort of traumatic episode, really. No, really, it was. It took me a long time to really process it and decide how to move forward because, because you see, that was kind of a boyhood ambition in the way that being a stand-up comic and comedy songwriter, I kind of wasn't.
Right.
Was writing science fiction books. Yeah. That's something I'd literally always wanted to do. And then I had this opportunity fall in my lap in 2011. I was in town. I was getting one of my kids' passports renewed. And I was doing it the same day thing, which you can no longer do for your kid's passport, incidentally. You can do it for grown-ups, can't do it for kids, because I think they're afraid of, dads ostensibly going out to Pizza Express and then smuggling them out the country. You know what I mean? So I think that's why they're not letting you do that anymore. But I was doing, so what it is, I handed in all the paperwork at about 11 a.m. I was given a piece of paper saying, come back and get it at like 4 p.m. So this was back when Twitter was lovely and friendly and nice. And I went on Twitter and said, hello, Hive Mind. I'm stranded in London for about 4 hours. Anybody got any thoughts? And I thought people would say, go and have lunch here or go and see this exhibition here. Yeah. And the Glance publisher's Twitter feed came out of the blue and went, come and talk to us about writing a book. And I went, all right, smart ass, let's put your money where your mouth is. So I found out where their office is, went round there and went to the front desk and said, tell whoever does Galance's Twitter feed that Mitch Benn has turned up. And it turned out to be this guy called Simon Spanton. And he said, I was just wondering if you got any ideas for science fiction books. And as I did have this idea for a science fiction book, which I'd have been tinkering with, kind of a kid's science fiction book called Terror, about a young girl who was abducted as a baby by well-meaning aliens. They think they're rescuing her rather than abducting her. And she then is subsequently adopted and raised by these aliens on this faraway planet, and everything which comes as it's kind of a spin on the Jungle Book / Tarzan / Superman is another example of that. If you want to, the other way around, isn't it? And I thought, why has nobody ever done that? And I did some quite serious Googling to make sure that nobody else had done that. And to my surprise, nobody else had written this story. So I thought, right, I'm doing it. And they signed me up. Galan signed me up for to do 2 books. And at the time I said, do you want book 2 to be the sequel to this, or do you want it to be something else entirely, just in case the first one, doesn't land? And they said to me at the time, no, we want it to be book 2 of a trilogy, because if we tell the retailers it's a trilogy, they'll be more keen to stock it. Because this was, just coming out that whole Harry Potter thing. And basically, if you're going to write anything sort of kids YA, then it had to be the first of 7, And I said, well, I can do the first of 3. I think it's only going to be... So I wrote the first one. The first one came out and was actually quite successful. Was in the Guardian's top 10 sci-fi for that year. Had lovely reviews in like the Times, the Independent, and everything. I remember at the time, I think they were kind of going for crossover hit because sci-fi is still a bit of a ghetto in publishing terms, weirdly. The late Ian Banks, of course, used to write all his psychological melodramas under his own name, like The Crow Road. And then he used to write Asimovian science fiction under the name Ian M. Banks. Yeah. And he would always laugh when interviews would say, well, obviously the science fiction is just for paying the bills and you're putting your heart and soul into everything else. He's like, oh, you sweet child, you think the sci-fi is paying the bills? And in actual fact, the sci-fi was the labor of love for him, and it was the Crow Road and shit that was paying the bills. Yeah. And literally the sci-fi was the labor of love. So I think they thought, because I've got this profile and other things, it's been. And I remember saying at the time, look, I know from bitter experience of playing to half-empty art centres that the Radio 4 crowd are immensely loyal as long as you don't ask them to leave the house or spend any money, right? While all you're asking them is not to change channel between the news and the Archers, they're fine. But if you actually want them to spend money or leave the house, then you're pushing your luck, And so, and I some people gave me a bit of shit for that, but I said, look, it's not like sort of the guy who's won X Factor putting out his ghostwritten biography. I don't have the kind of profile that's going to sell books, and I absolutely do not have the kind of profile that's going to sell bad books. So they're going to stand and fall. The first one came out, was actually pretty successful. The second one came out, and the deal went up for negotiation, and I just signed because everybody told me that I really should. I'd signed up with this quite powerful literary agent, and suddenly the deal went away and it never got renewed. And I was never really given a decent explanation as to why not. Because the first one apparently had been quite successful. The second one had literally only just come out and hadn't had time to succeed or fail. Literally, it come out like weeks previously, It hadn't had time to be successful or not. And such reviews as it got were very positive again. And I was just thrown in, and this put me, not even on square one. You're off the board now, because nobody's going to sign you up just to publish part 3 of a trilogy. And even if they did, the slightly awkward thing where parts 1 and 2 are in one publisher and part 3 is with a different one. And really nobody's going to sign you up purely in order to reprint books 1 and 2 of a trilogy. You see what I mean? So I was left kind of adrift for a long time, and never, still to this day, I've not really had a decent explanation as to what went wrong there. Because they were all gung-ho to renew the deal, and then suddenly it didn't happen. I wonder if those agents might have gone in a bit guns blazing on my behalf and had completely the wrong idea about how big a deal I was. That's possible. But I do know that I then had a sort of a very weird, long, protracted conversation with them about what I should do next. And basically the idea was, well, look, if you write something else, we can get that published. That will reestablish your authorial bona fides. And then maybe in due course, we can look at, relaunching this. So I had one idea that I worked on for about a year, and then a movie got announced with the same plot, so I dropped it. But that movie ultimately never came out, so I may revisit that in due course. And then I sent them they said, why don't you write something like the David Walliams stuff? And I'm like, okay, this is an American agency. Do they get how big a deal David is? You know what I mean? Do they get that he's about it? Because there is a thing Americans sometimes can't really, that whole thing with the Robbie Williams movie. The Americans seem genuinely quite angry that a rock star they'd never heard of would presume to have a biopic made about himself. Do you know what I mean? They seem really, how dare you, make a biopic when we've never heard of you. It's just like, there is such a thing as famous but not famous in the States. You know what I mean? And it's like, and sometimes I wonder if, this being an American base, because they had a London office, but the woman running the London office kept disappearing. She had compassionate leave and then maternity leave. And so I was always trying to deal with head office in New York. And they were the kind of people you had to make an appointment 2 weeks in advance to phone them. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I'm serious, and then thought, do they really get what a big deal David is? And the fact that, okay, the books are fine. I've read a bunch of them to my kids, in that kind of sub-Roald Dahl kind of way. But, they do get that this guy is massively famous in this country. And eventually, actually, bizarrely, my ex-wife, because she was starting to do some PA work for some other authors, she actually found herself for dinner with one of these people. And they said, no, the reason we keep telling him to write something like David Walliams is because David Walliams can only, with the best will in the world, these books are only little, but you can only write one a year. And they only take a week to read. So basically, you got parents all over the country with 51 weeks of the year going out their bloody minds, having to read Gangster Granny again. So he's actually created a market that he can't follow. Oh, okay, great, fine. Now that makes sense. So I wrote him a big long pitches for a bunch of, Roald Dahl-esque kids, like proper kids books. Yeah. And then it went, well, what about that other idea you had about a YA fantasy? And I went, okay, we'll go back to that idea. And this idea that I had about a YA fantasy, eventually, a central thing of it is that it's written in a made-up language. It's written in this kind of degraded English, where everything's kind of rephoneticized and grammatically a bit simplified and everything. And that actually becomes a plot point as to why this language is spoken by, because the whole thing's first person, so it has to be in there. And they're like, yeah, that's a terrible idea, change that. And I'm like, but it's kind of part of the plot that it's, no, we think that's a terrible idea, and we will never be able to sell that book if it's written in a made-up language. And I go, well, I think it's kind of about that. Why? Well, we don't want to work with you anymore. So they dropped me. Right, the agent dropped me. And then 6 months later, my old pal Liz Hyder, who I used to know when she was working in PR for BBC Radio, published a kids' YA book called Bearmouth, which is written in a made-up language, and it won all kinds of awards. And I'm like, it's not, I don't hate being right all the time. That's actually some bitter consolation. It's everybody else being wrong all the time that really winds me up. But yeah, so then by this time I was like, oh, screw it. But then at the time, I was my previous girlfriend, who I was with before I met Kathy, her background was in marketing, and she was like, I'd always really resisted the idea of self-publishing it because I know just what an absolute, and this is even before AI muscled in on the self-publishing thing and just literally started churning out shit novels on a half-hour basis, But even then, I was thinking, there's such a bloody mire out there. The idea of, but what she did, bless her, she actually worked quite hard on it. She actually just did a bit of research and said, look, if you're willing to spend a bit of money, like a couple of £1,000, and take a bit of time, like, getting somebody in to properly proofread it, getting some proper artwork done, you can, on the sort of the self-publishing end of, well, Amazon, Lulu, Kindle, all that, and particularly the print-on-demand end, you can come up with something that is kind of indistinguishable from the real thing, from the reader's point of view. And so I thought, all right, sod it. Because I'd already made the decision, look, I'm just going to write part 3. Yeah. And then we'll figure out what the hell to do with it. And rather nicely, because I've got this, Patreon, which I set up just after I got kicked off the radio in 2017. And thank Christ I did, because I never would have survived lockdown without it. That's another story, because I had friends who were like retraining as, teachers and coppers and that, because if all your income was live gigs, it just went away for like a year, But I got the patrons, I rounded up some of the people at Patreon to essentially be my beta team and read the first draft and give me feedback, on the understanding that they, get free copies of the book and acknowledgements and everything. Yeah. So they kind of had to be my editors, and then I paid somebody to proofread. We got these Ukrainian guys who I've been back in touch with. They're okay, thank Christ, because I hadn't spoken to them since the invasion, to do the artwork. And I reprinted all 3 I got the rights back to the first two and reprinted all three. Reprinted the first two with this new art, which I love. I was never that keen on the covers of the original. I thought they looked a bit gothic. These actually look like proper pulpy sci-fi. I went into like almost comic book kind of pulpy sci-fi, and so all three books, were out as of spring of 21, I think it was. And I have finally done the audiobook for book 3. Because I did audiobooks for the first two at the time, and I managed to buy the masters off of Orion. So I put the first two audiobooks back up when I reprinted them. Right. And I tried to do the audiobook for part 3 at home, and it didn't work. I just couldn't. I bought this incredibly good microphone, but if anything, it was too good because it picks up so much ambient sound. It's almost impossible to record it anywhere except inside, 4 feet of styrofoam. Do you know what I mean? If you're recording it in any place, it hears everything in that place. I tried to record in the cupboard under the stairs, and you could hear the electricity meter. It heard the humming and the ticking of the electricity meter. And I couldn't hear that with my ears, but the mic was picking it up. So, getting a really good mic is actually the kiss of death unless you've got a really, really insulated neutral space to use it in, But so I ended up going into this because I got roped into narrate an audiobook about 2 years ago by this American guy called Dane Hansen. He'd pitched it. He'd written it all the way back in 2000 and pitched it as a movie and couldn't get it made as a movie. And eventually decided, screw it, I'll write it up as a novel. But it's set in the year 2000 and it's set in Britain, although he's an American, because the idea was some numerological thing is triggered by the turn of the millennium, which revives all the dragons in Britain who have been asleep for 1,000 years, right? But there is some kind of bit of magical law, spell it either way, which means that the only people who can defeat dragons are knights, right? Unfortunately, by the year 2000 in Britain, knights means people like Elton John, right? So it's a book about, Sean Connery, Michael Caine, and Elton John versus a bunch of dragons, and they needed somebody who could do a reasonable stab at all these voices to narrate it. So it ended up coming to me, but I found myself in this really neat little studio in Acton, which is not that far from where I live. And while I was in there, I pitched the guy running it how much to come in here for a couple of days and just tear through that third book of mine in a proper studio. So that's what I did. And we finally got that completed. So it is difficult though, because ACX, which is the company that you upload stuff to for it to go on Audible, they're so finicky about noise floors and peaks and limits, and even when I reposted the audiobooks of the first two, which had already been up on Audible once, it quibbled a bunch of the settings. And I'm like, this has already been up on Audible. Anyway, but so hopefully book 3 is going up on Audible, any day now. I've got everything ready and there's no excuse for me not to. I'm just trepidatious about ACX. I find it so intimidating.
That wasn't Abandoned Studios in Acton, was it?
No, it's a tiny little one. It's called the London Voiceover Studio. Just literally, it's like this little cottage on this side street.
I just thought it would have been an extraordinary coincidence because of the one CD I recorded ever.
Yeah,
was Abandoned Studios in Acton, which I recorded with Rodney Slater from the Bonzo Dog Band.
Oh my word! That was one of the biggest disappointments of my life, right? In a career that's not been short of disappointments, probably the most crushing one. The most crushing one was, do you remember they did a Bonzo's reunion Christmas gig in 2006?
Yeah.
I think it was at the Shepherd's Bush Empire.
Yes.
And they had Phil Jupiter up, and I think they had Aid up, and they had all kinds of other people standing in for Viv, basically, and Neil. So I've worked with Neil Innes a few times. He came and played. We used to run a thing in London called the Distraction Club, which was basically a club just for the other musical comedians. Because, of course, the vicissitudes of the circuit being what it is, you almost never get a show with two musical comedians on. So I never got to see the other musical comedians. Right. So I used to run that place in order to basically, get to see and jam with them. Well, we had Neil on there a couple of times, and I'd already done some things with him up in Edinburgh and everything. And he's an absolute sweetheart, Neil, and I'm so sorry he's gone. But in 2006, they did that Bonzo's reunion gig, I think, and it went so well, they were going to do it again for 2007, and Neil asked me if I'd basically join the Bonzos for the 2007. So I'm going out my way. This is like Paul asking me to stand in for John with him and Ringo. You know what I mean? I mean, literally, you know.
Yeah.
And they pulled it. They pulled it. It just, I don't know why somebody got cold feet. They didn't pre-sell enough or something, but they just pulled it. It didn't happen. And I was devastated. Yeah. But that's, I was very nearly a peripheral Bonzo in 2007. I was gutted. I was gutted to say, you know, there's no shortage of things which, you know, I mean, it's, you know, and sometimes it can be quite difficult just to remain optimistic because so many people have blazed past me in the outside lane over the years. You know what I mean? It's like, and you know, it is difficult. It's a conscious decision because I do see people who are lost to bitterness, and it's very tempting because I think the one thing you really fear if you're a creative person who's tried to make a go of it in the creative industry and, you know, achieved whatever kind of level of success. I think the one thing you really fear is finally agreeing with everybody who told you were shit. You know what I mean? It's finally going, yeah, they were right. I suck. You know what I mean? It's finally, I can no longer hide from this. They're right. I'm shit. I think it's the one thing you really fear. Bitterness gets around that because bitterness basically enables you to carry on proclaiming your genius, but blaming literally everything else for the fact that it never happened. Do you see what I mean? Oh, if only those bastards hadn't, you know, those ungrateful twats, you know, these really amazing. You know, and so I can see how it'd be so easy to succumb to that because, you know, I mean, it's every Christmas I can't get off a tube train without walking past the 8-foot poster for either the sold-out arena tour or the best-selling DVD of somebody who the last time I saw him, he was opening for me at Bournemouth University in like, you know, 2007 or something. I mean, you know, the last time I saw John Bishop, he was on before me at the Belfast Empire. You know what I mean? You know, and it's like, you know, all these people have started out, you know, because that's the other thing. I said at the top that I was going to explain why. I almost try to never use the word headliner in the clubs, except when it's absolutely unavoidable. Because one of the things about being a big loud bastard with a guitar is I have gone on last at about 90% of all the gigs I've ever done. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. What happened with me is I didn't sort of work my way up the bills. I went from closing newbie nights to closing, you know, smaller money clubs, to closing medium-sized money clubs, to closing the big money clubs. But I've nearly always been on at the end because I'm the big loud bastard with a guitar. And there is a dynamic which suggests itself, which has really got absolutely nothing to do with who's better or who's senior. It's just there's a certain order it makes sense to put these guys on in, stick the big loud bastard with the guitar on at the end. So that's why I don't think of it as headlining, because that suggests that, you know, you are better or senior to everybody else is on the bill. And it's not. There are certain people who I think are some of the best comics in the country who you would always put on at the beginning because they're so bulletproof. Yeah. They're so reliable. Yeah. They will never let you down. They are feed punch meat potatoes. It's beautiful stuff. It's great stuff. But it's feed punch meat and potatoes. So you put those guys on at the beginning because let's face it, you can put anything on and call it a comedy club. It just means people will get on stage and try to be funny. You have no idea if it's going to be people you see it on live at the Apollo, some bunch of total chances, or, as is usually the case, people like me you may never have heard of, but have been doing it for 30 years and consequently have got quite good, you know? And some of those guys are the best comedians in the country, but you would only ever put them on at the beginning because you need somebody to reassure the audience that you're going to be okay. Yeah. You know, this is good stuff. It's funny and you're going to get it. You know, anybody a bit esoteric, you stick them on in the middle. Yeah. Because they've now got room to maybe, you know, you hope they're not going to crash and burn. But if you do, the audience knows, having seen the previous guy, it's not all going to be like this. And also, if you've still got somebody to go on at the end to pull it back, you know? Yeah. And then just purely, you know, for example, there are acts I can't follow Phil Nickel. I can't follow Phil Nickel. I can't follow Phil Nickel in a taxi, right? Because the thing is, there's enough overlap between what we do. It's not just we both got guitars. It's the fact that he is so frenetic and high energy
Yeah.
that if I go on after him, I feel like a slightly watered down version of what they've just got. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, he can follow me, and indeed has done on a few occasions. You know, he can follow me because he comes across as a frenzied version of what they've just had, you know. So that works, you know, but there are certain people. True story, I was reminded of this about a few months ago. Kathy grew up in Wolverhampton and almost never goes back there. And the only time she ever goes back there is to see gigs at the Wolf Civic, because it's her favourite rock venue in the country. Because it's a lot of bands' favourite rock venue, because it manages to pull off that weird trick of being big enough to be big and small enough to be intimate. You know, so in particular, we've been to see The Darkness there twice, because it's the perfect room for those guys. So it's big enough to be silly, but small enough that you feel like you're in the same room as them. You know what I mean? Yeah. And the last time I went there, I was in the Gents, and I came across Sean Percival, who's a black country comic who I'd not seen for years. Great compare. And I was very kind of him to do this. He better, he was a bit pissed, but he's still very kind of him to do this. He said, I was just talking about you the other day. I was talking about the time that we were all on in the Cardiff Glee, and Lee Evans was on in the middle, and you had to go on after him, and we all thought you were wasting your fucking time, including you. And not only did you fucking smash it, by the end of the night, they were all up on their feet singing Bloody Delilah. And I remember it was so nice of him to say that. But yeah, that was a thing that happened a few times, because the Glee clubs, big clubs in Cardiff and Birmingham at the time, were run by Off the Curb, but also Lee's management company. And Lee was going out on tour. And so he was trying out new shit. And because it was new shit, they put him on in the middle, which meant on both these occasions I had to go on after him. And this is when he's just done like that bloody Christopher Walken movie. It's absolute height of his powers. He'd just done a thing, you know, the producers in the West End, you know, absolute height of his powers. I think you've got to be bloody kidding. But at the end of the day, it's just, I think the audience understood the ridiculousness of the situation enough to give me the benefit of the doubt. And I got away with it, you know. But oddly enough, later, they did the same thing with Jeff Green. Jeff Green was one of those guys. He was always kind of up and coming, and it never really happened as big as it was kind of supposed to for some reason. Brilliant comic. And for about 3 or 4 years, it's like he was going to be the next thing. And for some reason, I don't know what it was. And I think, but weirdly, I found Jeff much harder to follow than Lee. And I realized it's because Lee, for all that he was like one of the biggest comics in the country, on stage, he's a low status presence.
Right.
He's a panicky, sweaty little arsehole. You know what I mean? But you know what I mean? He is a low status presence when he's like panicky, sweaty, and oh shit, hang on, oh God, it's all going wrong. You know what I mean? Whereas Jeff was all a bit cool. You know, Jeff was kind of had it all going on. And weirdly, for all that Jeff, in terms of, you know, standing in the industry, was not as big a deal as Lee at the time, he was harder to follow because he was just had that kind of swagger, you know. And I remember thinking, that's, you know, the dynamics of that are fascinating, aren't they? You know what I mean? They really are. Anyway.
Well, I'm going to come to my last question. But before that, how can listeners find out all about you, all your fine works, and when I can come and see you performing?
Kathy has done a lot of work on my website recently, which is inevitably mitchbenn.com, MITCHBENN, to the point where it is now a multi-layer, multimedia thing of wonder, which has this very extensive toolbar across the top of the screen in which you can click on all my various projects. So there's like a whole page for the Layer Effect Tour. There's a whole page for this year's Edinburgh show, which is called Asking Elvis, because that replies to another curious chapter in my life, which is that there was a thing for about 10 years on Steve Wright in the afternoon.
Yeah, I was going to mention.
Which became the most popular thing on Steve Wright in the afternoon, which was basically the biggest show on British radio at the time. Basically, people would phone in with questions about anything, and they would be answered by Elvis. And Elvis was me. Well, I was me the whole time. I was doing Elvis the whole time. What was my idea? I was doing an hour show all the time, and one of the producers, Steve, came into the producer of the now shows. Who do you know does Elvis? And so, whatever, it's always Mitch who does it when it comes up as a voice in one of the sketches or something. So I got dragged in to be Elvis on this thing because I think they'd asked a bunch of people. I know they'd asked Rob Brydon, he was too bloody busy. And I think they might have asked actual Elvis impersonators, but a lot of them can't do the speaking voice. And of course, they don't have my background in improv where I can become Elvis and then just stay as Elvis and just go off on one about whatever. But it was this really weird time when it was this massively popular thing, and we'd always decided we were never going to say who it was, which I guess got a bit of a kick out of, but it was also kind of frustrating knowing that, you're the most popular thing on the biggest show on British radio, and it's not really doing you any good. You can't really parlay into anything. But there was a hilarious incident when I was at a party, I think it was at Marcus Brickstock's house, and this is when this is all happening. Every now and again, somebody would be listening and they'd figure out who it was. Like I would laugh, and it would be obviously my laugh, or I would say something, and Dan Antopolsky turned up at this party. Now, Dan, I don't even know if he's credited, but in the flashback sequences at the beginning of the movie of the Da Vinci Code, Dan is briefly glimpsed as Jesus, right? Because Dan, again, has got those great sort of Ashkenazi features. You stick him in a long white nightie and a wig, and he's Jesus, right? So in all the flashback sequences where you briefly glimpse Jesus at the beginning of it, it's Dan in a nightie, right? And I'd heard about this. I thought, oh, that's brilliant. That's perfect. So Dan walks at this party, and his sponsor goes, Rich, is that you being Elvis on Steve, right? And I went, yes. Is that you being Jesus in the Da Vinci Code? And he went, yes, it is. And I said, right, well, I'm secretly Elvis, you're secretly Jesus, so we call it a draw. But yeah, so it's that it led to this weird. So that's what this year's Edinburgh show is about how much fun it was, but also what a weird experience it was. But things like Phil Glenister and John Sim would come in and say, when's Elvis on? We're hoping Elvis is going to be here. Whenever Elvis comes on, we shut down production for 10 minutes. We can all listen to it. Things like that, and it's because it's the time Ashes to Ashes is on, and it's just this weird. So that's what this year's Edinburgh show is going to be about. And there's another thing in the toolbar for Christmas carols, thing in the toolbar for everything else I'm doing. So mitchbenn.com has become, quite a decent online resource. Because I'm reviving some of my old shows. That's the other thing, I did 37th Beatle again recently in the last few months, partly because the second time it was videoed professionally, and that'll be up online sometime soon, apparently. But also I'm doing it again at the Rick Mail Festival. I'm on the lookout for Beatles conventions I could do it at, because they can't do tribute bands all weekend. There's only so many left-handed bass players in the country. So yeah, I at some point I'd like to do that because the other thing I love doing is science fiction conventions. So I've done a few of those over the year. That's probably the closest I ever get to play in the home crowd. You know what I mean? Is playing sci-fi conventions. So but yeah. So mitchbenn.com is basically your online resource for all things Mitch. And if they really want to help out, they can go to patreon.com/mitchbenn, because that's the thing which actually keeps the lights on. Because as I say at the end of the show, it's just you and me now, folks. The BBC ain't picking the phone up anytime soon. The YouTube's not paying for itself. Neither is the TikTok, and the less said about the OnlyFans, the better. So, yeah. I did once hear somebody called podcasting the ugly white blokes OnlyFans. I just thought it was brilliant.
Well, I could attest to that.
Oh, yes.
So it only remains for me to ask my final question, of course, the question in line with the title of the show, the one I must ask. How, Mitch, would you sum up comedy in a nutshell?
It's the great release valve of the human spirit. I did a whole show about this, the point about, particularly satirical comedy. What does it achieve? What does it do? Does it actually serve any purpose? Yes. The weird thing about comedy, of course, is on a purely evolutionary biological level, we still don't really know why it exists, but it obviously serves some kind of purpose. And I think, societally, it definitely serves, It is the great release valve. It is, on a political level, on a societal level, on an interpersonal level. It's and also it's, I don't know. It can provide insight into. It can make points in a way that doesn't beat people in submission. The way they don't necessarily feel like, you can preach at people without them feeling they're being preached at.
Yeah.
Or you can just, I've always described observational comedy, and to say, Billy Connolly's the all-time great exponent of this, is telling people what they didn't know they knew. You're not telling them anything they don't know or anything they know. You're telling stuff they didn't know they knew. When you suddenly realize that this guy's talking about your life, but in a way that you've never thought about it before.
Yeah.
So I think that's what it is. It's the great release valve, if you wanted a more pithy little description of it.
Mitch, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I truly appreciate you being a guest. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome.